We are in the 5th week of PTR testing. 11.2 is coming out in 9 days and the season in 16 days. And this week we got a single, very late, tuning patch on the Friday. A few of the bottom specs got massive buffs and a few of the top specs got small nerfs. Frost DK got hit with a 3% nerf. These other changes are just minor fixes or buffs to talents you don't play. A 3% nerf is unlikely to change much about the spec. Frost is still looking quite good. Druid DPS are slightly less terrible after both Balance and Feral got an 8% buff. Both specs still looking to be at the bottom of single target and not particularly great on AoE either. Org got a personal damage increase and a buff to Chrono Warden to incentivize them to press buttons other than Living Flame. Overall, a pretty small buff. There is potential in Org comps, but I haven't found enough data or seen enough people playing them to make an accurate judgment. I don't think the spec is remotely as powerful as it has been in the past though. And then Dev Evoker got a massive buff to their AoE. 20% on two of their biggest abilities, adding up to a 10 to 11% buff in dungeon overall, and maybe even about 15% buff to their AoE burst. Dev was already doing good AoE and is now looking quite obscene. And they were doing quite good single target, and that also got a 3% buff. BM Hunter took some big nerfs, a 5% aura nerf and then a stampede nerf and pet nerf on top of that, apparently about 9% total. I think the spec is only looking decent now and is likely to be overtaken completely by marksmanship, which did get a nerf of its own. A relatively small reduction in Black Arrow, and they also reverted the previous buff to the Sentinel set. Regardless, Hunter is still looking to be one of the top overall classes and is still quite far above most other classes. It's also looking to be in the upper quarter of classes in Raid, but the variance is absolutely insane. Fire Mage took a big hit to Ignite, which is majority of the spec's damage. Frostfire did get some buffs, but I don't think you play it still. It is likely that Arcane will once again overtake it and become the M+ spec for Mage. Arcane got no changes this week. Frost got a minor nerf to Frostfire. Shadow Priest got very large buffs to Archon, which was far behind, now it's not. These came with a nerf to Insidious Ire, which counteracted every buff for Void Weaver, so Void Weaver is actually down a bit. Lots of people are playing Archon Shadow now in M+, and Archon can reach very high durations of Void form. It can last for a minute 30, maybe even longer. Also coming with this is a Psychic Link buff, which I counted to be the 13th change in Psychic Link since Dragonflight was released. Now, Enhancement Shaman finally got a bug fix for Totemic. It is now actually a 200% effectiveness Primordial Storm that does not benefit from Maelstrom Weapon. But that means it's the equivalent of a 4 Maelstrom Primordial Storm with no extra effects like Imbues or anything. So it only ends up doing about 6 to 7% of your damage. I tried some Totemic keys, it seems okay, but I think Stormbringer is probably still better, and Enhance is looking down for Raid at the moment. On the other hand, Ellie Shaman is looking up with massive buffs to every single target ability. Some of these scale into AoE a bit, like Lava Burst or Elemental Blast. Ellie also sees a fix for the Farseer tier set, taking it from giving 25% cast speed to 25% damage, which seems to make it a 5% tier set instead of a 0.7% tier set. Altogether, this adds up to a 22% buff for Farseer, or an 18% buff for Stormbringer single target. There's also a buff to Farseer Ancestors Chain Lightning, however this ability is still capped to 3 targets. Ellie is definitely very strong now. We saw an expected nerf to Diabolus Demonology, as it was by far the highest simming spec. It's still looking like the highest simming spec, just not by so much anymore. And the relevance of Demonology in M+ is likely gone as a result of this nerf. Affliction did get some nice single target buffs though, and I have heard good things about their prio. And both DPS Warrior specs got a flat 5% buff. I think both these specs are quite decent in M+ now, and Fury might be looking good for Raid. They edited the post later to add a buff to Windwalker and Shadowpan. The spec isn't looking terrible anymore. I still don't think it's particularly good in keys though. Now to look at tanks. They buffed Vengeance Demon Hunter. I don't really understand this change. They gave VDH an 8% damage buff, which I guess is fine because they were behind in damage and this could be a raid related buff. But then they nerfed the VDH mastery. I think VDH has one of the worst masteries in the game and they nerfed it. Not really sure why they did this. I've heard with the base mastery, this is around a 2% reduction in armor or something like that. Along with the VDH buff, they also buffed the damage of 2 more underperforming tanks. Guardian got a 12% and Blood got an 8%. The other 3 tanks were unchanged. And to look at healers, there were no changes. No changes to Rogue as well, and a few other specs. Now, I didn't make a tier list this week because the patch came out so late and I don't really have accurate data. So I'm just going to make a brief prediction of the meta. VDH getting buffed means it seems quite likely to be a VDH season again. Resto Druid seems to be the strongest healer and fills the Druid void because all other Druid specs are bad. So you could form a DPS comp of Mage, DK, and Shadow Priest that covers all typical buffs and utility while also having a very tanky DK in. However, this comp might be a bit behind in damage because there are specs doing more overall. I would say that Dev Evoker, and Ellie are looking to be the strongest overall classes. So maybe you would want to slot one of those in. Of course, this is nothing final, and if, say, they buff Boomy again, this might all change. Now, we saw some crazy changes to dungeons this week that made Gambit and Halls a bit more cumbersome. In Gambit, they made Fishsticks cast instantly. This means that there is no way to stop them. If a Scalebinder is in a pool, he will drop a fish stick every 28 seconds, and you have to commit to kill it or kite the pack away. This makes it very hard to play multiple Scalebinders and incentivizes playing as few as possible because they are guaranteed time loss. And a lot of classes' abilities just don't hit fish sticks because they are totems. For example, Tempest does 0 damage to fish sticks even if you main target it. The first boss got a change to his random damage mechanic that used to one-shot people with little warning. It now shows a debuff on 3 players and does the damage after a few seconds. They also nerfed it by 30%, so it probably doesn't one-shot until the very highest keys. The second boss, which was now considered a very hard and annoying boss after they added a dispel mechanic, was unchanged though somehow. And in the last area, they took the devoted accomplices that used to cast Reinvigorate and removed all of their abilities, making them target dummies. Streets didn't see many changes. A few tank busters were nerfed, and they also reduced the duration of the Cat's Bleed and the shield of the music boss. In Halls of Atonement, they made the Curse of Obliteration a magic dispel, so there are no more curse dispels in this dungeon. It's a bit weird though, because now only the healer can dispel this debuff, but they also have to dispel Collect Sins and the new tank debuff, which is a stacking damage amp. On the shard pools, the healer will have to choose to dispel between 4 different debuffs at a time. They did kind of nullify the Gargons though. Last week they added a stacking bleed to them that did a lot of damage to the tank, and this week they straight up removed it. They also nerfed the 3rd and 4th boss a bit. They did make some changes to items this week. They added a new Verse Mastery neck to Operation Floodgate and a new Crit Verse neck to Priority. So now there are 5 neck drops in the dungeon pool, which is a lot better than last season, although 3 of them have Verse on them, which isn't desirable on a neck for majority of classes. Also, a few weeks ago, they did add an item for each armor type to Floodgate as well. They buffed the new Reshirap's cloak effect by a large 150%, so now instead of doing about 2% of someone's damage, it can do 4 to 5%. This also increases the value of the boots from raid by a lot. We saw an article about the new raid BOEs, which have randomized stats, but it doesn't really matter because 3 of the BOEs are boots, which will just be worse than a normal pair of cantrip boots from raid, and 4 of the BOEs are in tier slots that would likely be catalyzed. The Halls of Atonement trinket that I spoke about last week, Cursed Stone Idol, got a massive nerf, down about 45% from a 13k crit on use to a 7k crit on use. It's definitely a little under budget now considering it has a cast time. Also, I believe they nerfed the healer trinket, Twisted Mana Sprite, which was previously giving people shields that were randomly extremely high, and now it looks like it's doing a half to a third of the healing it was before. Other things that were changed this PTR is the Champion Track Delve Trinket Vendor is now on a daily rotation for some reason, and there is now a currency to show you how many sparks you have earned in the season. Next week will be the last week of PTR testing. I'm not expecting any more major tuning patches. They did seem like they were slowing down this week. I do expect a few more minor tuning hotfixes though, because the difference between the bottom and the top specs in a single target sim is still like 25%. I think from here they will be tuning fully around raid probably.